In the small village of Buena, inside the Fitoa region, snow would fall. It was fast approaching the end of fall and into winter. The blue-haired mage Roxy had left the village, having imparted the last of her knowledge upon her young, impressionable apprentice. Rudy had taken it in, Subaru, and he was thinking of ways now in which he could be able to further his magic and, more importantly, his swordsmanship. He'd been training with his father, Paul, every single day since then, not to mention his closest and best friend, Sylphie. She had quickly been growing even faster than he was in magic, with her unique application of magic even allowing her to do silent healing, an ability that Subaru was inept at, mostly because he barely practiced silent casting, instead opting to focus on his swordsmanship and improving his memorization of different casts. Regardless, through his hard work, Rudeus would actually have reached the intermediate level in Water God style. This was pretty impressive, considering that Rudy, unbeknownst to Paul, was unable to wield Toki. While Subaru has taken over Rudeus' body, the problem is that due to his Laplace factor, he will never be able to use Toki, meaning that the manipulation of mana to increase his physical strength and abilities is inaccessible to him. However, his large and robust mana pool is still usable for other forms of combat. As the days had turned into weeks, Rudy and Sylphie had gotten particularly close. Paul, Zenith, and Lilia would have noticed the amount of dependence that Sylphie was having on Rudeus. In other news, Zenith would come out with an announcement to the family. Fall had met its end, and winter was quickly taking its place. Zenith would announce to the family that Rudeus would be a big brother, and that Zenith was pregnant with her second child. Paul would be now shaking in joy and happiness, with the entire family sharing this incredibly warm moment. Subaru would be excited to have the opportunity to be an older brother. Having been an only child in his last life, he had no experience with siblings, so this was a new experience for him. He was looking forward to it. But that momentary happiness would quickly end, when Lilia would announce just a few short days later that, in fact, she was also pregnant. Subaru's jaw would drop as he turns, looking towards Paul behind him at the table. Zenith's eyes following the same path as Rudy, with Paul quickly taking to a Dogazop position, basically bowing and begging them for forgiveness, saying that it's his kid, and basically coming out with the fact that he had been cheating on Zenith with Lilia for who knows how long. Subaru would feel a mix of emotions, again remembering that night when he had saved Sylphie and when Roxy had come after him. When, Paul had overreacted and taken some stranger's side over him, not even listening to him or hearing him out. This would be kind of the final straw for Subaru, with Zenith now smacking Paul. Subaru would totally agree with his mom, realizing that this guy is kind of a scumbag. Meanwhile, while Zenith was engaging in domestic violence, Subaru would turn looking at Lilia. Behind her, an open window pane, with a blizzard raging out in the snow. Lilia would continue saying to the family that she plans to return home to her family, in the Asura Kingdom. Rudeus would swallow, with Subaru realizing that if this happens, there's no way that she'd make it. Just thinking about the travel time alone, and in the middle of winter, that's insane. There would be tension visibly in the air. As Paul would be sitting ashamed, now his head down on the table, Subaru would sigh, just shaking his head at him. Zenith would be sitting across from Lilia, with her hands against her forehead, clearly stressed thinking about this decision. It was evident to Subaru that no one wanted Lilia to leave, but they also had no idea on how to address this, or how to move forward from it. To get out of the tension, and due to him not being naturally as quick of a thinker and manipulator as the original Rudeus, Subaru would sneak out of the house saying he'll be back, with him shutting the door quietly behind him and using fire magic with silent casting to melt the snow in front of him as he walks a path towards Sylphie's house. He would knock on the door where Laws, the father of Sylphie, would open it, saying, "Oh, Rudeus, what brings you here during the middle of a snowstorm?" Subaru would shake his hand saying, "No, Mr. Laws, it's all fine." He'd also greet Sylphie's mother, with them calling toward her that Rudeus had come to visit her. She'd come running down the steps as she says, "Rudy," with the two of them embracing. Subaru would talk to Sylphie, asking what she thinks about the whole situation, since he has no idea what they should do. Explaining his thoughts on why he doesn't think it's fair for Lilia to get kicked out because of, well, his dad. This is where we get to see a difference in culture between Subaru and this world. With Subaru obviously not having noticed this because of his mother's religion being a follower of Millis. Sylphie would ask, "What's the big deal?" Rudeus would be confused, asking, "What do you mean, what's the big deal? He cheated on my mom." With this term now coming into play, Sylphie and Rudeus would come into that culture clash I was just talking about, with her saying that it's pretty normal for some people to have multiple wives. She doesn't see why Lilia doesn't just marry Paul. Huh. You don't say. Subaru would thank Sylphie as well as her parents, with him leaving the home after an hour of playing around, once again warming his palm with a ball of flame as he melts a path out of the home, tracing his steps back to his home on the hillside, where the tension of the room has not slackened one bit. If anything, it's gotten worse since Subaru left. It's here now where Rudeus would intervene, with him walking up to Zenith and stating pretty much what he had come to a conclusion on by confirming with Sylphie. "I just don't think it's fair to make Lilia leave because I thought that having another younger sibling would be a good thing. Then I'll have 2 younger brothers or sisters, right?" Subaru would grab Zenith's hand. Zenith would clasp her son's hand. Zenith's breathing would be heavy. Again, Subaru's values would align more with Millis, with him believing that his mom is in the right. However, Subaru was quite fond of Lilia. Needless to say, he didn't want Lilia and her child to be cast out into the snow, and potentially to their deaths because of this incident. Just like in the original, Zenith's breathing would pop as she says, "Fine, Rudy, I can't win with you," as she'd grab his face, pulling on his cheeks. She'd walk over, looking to Aisha as she grabs her hand, saying that she'll stay with them, saying that they're not going to have her going anywhere, at least especially not now. Lilia would feel tears rolling up in her eyes, as the two haven't exactly made up, but the tension has definitely lessened, with Zenith approving of them. And bonus points, Subaru didn't even have to blame Paul for it to work. So when spring comes around again and Paul and Subaru continue their training, he would not be going quite as hard on him as the original Rudeus had endured. At the end of winter, something strange had happened. Some of you might have noticed during the first part of this series that I mentioned that due to Subaru's nature and his lack of goals and desires, as we've seen during ReZero, he had no real inclination to train his magic or to become stronger. All of his training with Wilhelm during the end of Season 1 was his desperation to feel like he was doing something, anything to look like he was doing something for Amelia. Well, in this version, due to that lackadaisical nature we see from the original Subaru and where he's at during this time of his life, he, as many commented on, is actually a year behind the original Rudeus. With his training with Roxy having been slightly faster, he would not have entered the Boreas estate as quickly. As such, we would see a black and orange hole in the sky, having just appeared, a tiny dot on the sky's horizon. One benefit of having Roxy in the house a year later means that Aisha and Norn are technically an extra year younger. Having Roxy in the house meant Paul was trying to be more considerate, meaning that several events have now been pushed later and earlier, particularly the ages of these two. As spring arrived, and a few months later, this is when Aisha and Norn would be born, with Sylphie coming over to visit them and to talk with Rudeus, of course. As I mentioned earlier with all the kids, Paul, Zenith, and Lilia had noticed the dependency that was forming between Rudeus and Sylphie. As such, when Rudeus had stopped growing and training, Paul noticed his frustrations, and he would have talked to both Lilia and Zenith about it, wondering if there's anything they can do. This is when the discussion from Roxy came up about sending him to either, the Kingdom of Renoa or to the Lagunica capital. While they all felt he was still too young, when Subaru would openly vent one day saying he feels like he's not getting anywhere, Paul would write a letter, that being to his former companion, Ghislane. Paul had finally decided to send the letter after one day walking through town when he'd see his son, Rudeus, trying to sell stone statues of these strange cat beast folk in maid outfits. Clearly something was going on. He'd hear Rudeus calling out with this creation from his earth magic, trying to sell these detailed and intricate stone statues. When Paul walked up asking him, "What are you doing?" Rudeus would turn, saying, "I'm just trying to earn a little bit of pocket change and, practice my earth magic. That's all. I figured maybe someone would be interested in these." Of course, Subaru was hiding the real reason. He was hoping to earn enough income to where he could afford to have Sylphie come with him to go train at one of these magical universities. With the idea of going off to school again, and maybe actually doing better this time in something he's good at, being something Subaru was interested in. The biggest difference between Subaru and the original Rudeus here is that he actually was selling some things besides stone statues. He had created useful tools. Using earth magic, he'd been able to develop incredibly hard and dense materials, like screws or clasps. Materials that typically made out of iron would be far more expensive and difficult to acquire. With these more common items being actually sold, Subaru had made about 6 silver. Paul was kind of impressed, considering that Buena is in the middle of nowhere. It was clear that Rudeus must have been doing this for a while. So naturally, after this conversation, Paul would have sent the letter. In the few short weeks after that, Subaru had once again come up to Paul and Zenith, explaining that he was hoping to go to the University of Magic in Renoa. With it being closer to Buena and the Asura Kingdom than the Witch Continent, which was far across the world, he figured that it was the best option. This is when Paul would have a stroke of genius, stating that he had already thought about this possibility, saying that while he would be fine with paying for Rudy, Sylphie was a completely other option, as he pulls out the hidden coin sack that Rudeus had been collecting for the last couple months. While it's honorable you're trying to pay for her, have you thought about how her parents would feel about this? Or us, Rudy? Subaru would sigh, saying he had thought about it, and he didn't want to ask his parents to pay for another person, especially knowing how expensive the tuition was. Paul would interrupt him, "And that's why I've got you a job." "Huh? A job?" "Yeah, you're pretty book smart, right? And it's not like you're getting any better with the sword either." Subaru would grimace. With his hands looking all calloused, he'd been swinging that damn thing for months, and he hasn't improved at all, reaching pretty much the peak of what he can accomplish with the Water God style. And even though Paul was advanced in all 3 forms of sword styles, there was only so much he could teach, due to him being a natural himself. Subaru had only picked up this much due to sheer effort. Paul would explain to Subaru, saying that he's gotten him a job for a noble in the Fatoa region, the Boreas family. He would tell Rudy that she should be arriving within the week or so. That is, the guard who's coming to accompany him back to the Boreas region in Fatoa. Wait, hold on. A noble? Did you sell me? He'd grab his body saying, "Kia! No, I can't go to a noble." Zenith would laugh with Paul asking what that routine is. Subaru would apologize, saying, "Okay, what kind of job is it really though?" At this point, Nora would start crying, subsequently followed by Aisha. Lilia and Zenith would stand now accompanying their children, with them commenting on how, after Rudeus was born, it was uncommon for him to ever cry, seeing that this was probably the more normal experience. Paul would laugh, now putting his finger under his nose, saying, "Well, since you're so book smart, I figured that, well, you can figure it out." Huh? So he's signing up for a job and he's not even going to tell me what it is? However, because Subaru would know about this job coming ahead of time, he would have time within this week to let Sylphie know what's happening. Meaning that we're not going to have that same outburst of magic that she had used and originally attacked Paul with. He would explain to Sylphie that he's going off to work to afford tuition for her so that both of them can attend to the University of Magic at Renoa Academy. Sylphie had been in on the plan, with the both of them having been working together to sell some of the magic items that they'd been making, namely the self-tightening magic screw that Paul was impressed by. Sylphie would cry saying, "No, you can't leave," with her now hugging onto Subaru. He'd be surprised, asking, "Sylphie, but this is the plan, right? You said you wanted to learn more magic, and I have nothing else I can even teach you." Sylphie would cry while Subaru would stroke her hair, saying, "Shh, it's fine. Don't cry right now. Your dad's watching us. He's gonna think I did it." Sylphie would laugh, rubbing her eyes, with Subaru smiling at this, saying that she looks much better when she's smiling. Once again, we can see Subaru's proclivities towards elf girls, but I digress. Another difference that's kind of a shame is that while Paul does view Rudeus as like a genius and a prodigy, he doesn't find him to be as adult as he did in the original. We know this because during the last part, when Sylphie became Rudeus's friend, Subaru displayed an immense amount of immaturity, with him still being like 18. He's pretty much the same age, if not younger, than Paul and Zenith by a few years in his original life. This has resulted in an overall experience different from the original Rudeus, where Subaru doesn't treat Paul like a friend or as much as he does an idol. He used to idolize Paul before everything happened with Lilia and Sylphie, and he realized that he's just a person. However, this big difference has resulted in him telling Rudeus about the job and not making him fight to knock him out to send him on with Ghislane. Instead, Subaru is aware of the situation and, in fact, is encouraging it, so when he and Sylphie leave, they actually get to say goodbye, with Paul and Zenith and Rudeus getting to have an actual family moment and him saying goodbye to his parents. Subaru would tear up, with this reminding him of, well, his former parents, not having thought about them as much in this life so far. With him saying goodbye to his new set of parents, he would begin to think about it. Zenith would brush away his tears, saying, "Oh honey, it's okay," with Subaru now once again displaying that difference in mental maturity, because he isn't a 45-year-old man-child. Paul would laugh, telling Rudeus, saying that, well, he should stop the waterworks. He'd poke Subaru in the head, saying, "Rudy, we'll see you on your 10th birthday, okay?" He'd give him a fist bump, and Subaru would give him a hug on his leg. We'd again have that same scene between Ghislane, Paul, and Zenith, with them having now met up for the first time in several years. Ghislane would now eye up Rudeus, saying that he seems, rather polite for Paul's kid. Subaru would wipe away his tears, saying, "It's nice to meet you, I'm Rudeus Greyrat. I hear that I'm going to be working for you, or with you. I'm still not entirely sure of what that whole deal is about." Ghislane would yawn, climbing back into the carriage, saying, "Come on, we gotta get going." Sylphie would hug Rudeus again one last time, saying that she'll see him soon, okay? With them promising to meet again on his 10th birthday. With Eris's birthday fast approaching and his own as well, this means that he has roughly around a year at the Boreas residence. Of course, none of the characters here actually know that. Subaru would join Ghislane, now heading toward the Boreas estate in the Fatoa region. When he meets Philip for the first time, his thoughts of him were that he looks like a fox. Subaru would have also been interested in Ghislane being a beast person, and having entered the Boreas estate would have noticed that almost all of the waitstaff, the butlers and maids, they were all beastkin. When Philip introduces himself as Philip, now Rudeus Greyrat, Rudeus would have another epiphany. Subaru would think about it, realizing, is this just nepotism? Okay, sounds good to me. Rudeus would ask Philip what he exactly would like him to do, only hearing so far that he'd been offered a job. Gulping, not exactly knowing what Philip, his relative, was looking for from him, or what Paul had promised him. Philip would laugh, saying, "Paul, your father didn't even tell you that, huh?" That's just like him. He explained that his daughter, Eris, is going to be turning 10 in 2 months. Rudeus, Subaru, is currently 8 years old, with his birthday also approaching with him turning 9. Although, like I mentioned, they only celebrate birthdays every 5 years, so he knew being 10 was a huge deal in this world. It was also the age he'd be turning in roughly a year and a half from now, the small black speck in the sky slowly gaining strength over that time. Anyway, back to Eris. Philip would ask Rudeus if he's capable of teaching her, specifically teaching her magic, reading, writing, and math. Now, Subaru was a fairly good student, so he'd confidently answer that he's capable of doing that easily. With Rudeus now being accompanied by Philip and the staff, Subaru would come to realize quickly that he was in for a shock. Subaru would respectfully enter, now entering on one knee, as he holds his hand up saying, Lady Eris, I am here to become your tutor in magic, math, and all things school. Eris would turn, her red hair flowing in the wind as her crimson eyes meet with this Rudeus. She would again respond saying that for someone younger he's too cheeky, now smacking him across the face. Subaru would be shocked, realizing that this is the problem that Philip was talking about. As he touches his cheek, this having been the first time since Paul that he'd been hit by another person. Subaru would stand saying, well, I might be younger than you, but at least I can keep my hands to myself. Huh? We get the iconic image of Eris punching our boy in the face. With Rudeus going flying, he'd stand up, trying to step back, not realizing exactly what kind of monster he'd awakened. Eris would have steam practically coming out of her ears as she runs after him screaming, saying, get back here, take it like a man. While Philip would watch in horror, wondering how long this will last. Subaru would be running Temple Runner style, using magic and wind magic specifically to give him an advantage in speed. With this monster chasing him down, she would be the antithesis of ladylike, like a bull in a china shop. Eris was, to say the least, an entire force of nature. Upon escaping, he'd reconvene with Philip, with him breathing heavily, saying, your daughter is lovely. So ladylike. Yes, it's quite the description of my girl there, isn't it? Well, won't you be giving up now, my good nephew? Subaru would laugh, saying that if he let this stop him, then there's no way he'd get anywhere. Saying that he has an idea, telling him to give him a couple days. Subaru had not given up yet. If there's one thing that Subaru has always been good at, it's dealing with kids, as we've seen throughout ReZero Season 1 when he was engaging with Meili, Petra, and the others. So he has a plan. Instead of trying to come up with this kidnapping plot, he would challenge Eris in a more productive way, that is, with a sword. Eris was, if anything, only good at attending one training session of study, and that was the sword, where Ghislane would train her. Subaru was even impressed with Ghislane, realizing how strong she was within the first training session that he asked to join in on. Eris was irritated, not wanting to share her Ghislane with him, but his rebuttal would actually be pretty strong, telling Eris that it might be nice for her to having a sparring partner who's not Ghislane every now and then, to test her strength. It's at this point where we would actually get to see our first fight between Subaru and someone else using magic, aside from, having taken care of those kids. In this version, we see Subaru using everything at his disposal to fight Ghislane. Eris would have been watching him training with the sword. With his hands having been clearly calloused, it was clear to Eris that he trained with the sword pretty hard. When the fight began with Ghislane, he asked her to go easy on him. Ghislane would laugh, saying that she's got a bit of pent-up anger against Paul, so that might be a little tough. She'd start off light, now moving forward and attacking at Rudeus. Subaru would back up using magic as he says out loud, "Stone cannon," blasting a stone cannon and editing its speed and velocity. The blast of earth magic would shake as she cuts it through the air, slicing it cleanly. While he wasn't a match for her at this time, he knew that even with his Water God style, he'd be able to parry some of her lighter attacks. Using Water God style, he'd parry some of her strikes, with Ghislane going severely easy on him. He'd then use what Rudeus in the original timeline was known for, using his quagmire, turning the grok beneath them into a marsh. Ghislane would feel her feet slipping as she jumps up into the air, creating some distance between herself and Rudeus. Rudeus would hold his hand over the wooden sword as he slides it across the blade, forcing his magic power from his mana into the ingrains of the sword. He cast water magic, increasing it and creating a blade of water before freezing it with ice magic. Subaru would have used wind magic to leap into the air, slashing down with his extended reach, even managing to cut and graze Ghislane's arm. She'd be impressed, not having realized this was something a mage could do, with Rudeus having used silent casting to create an original spell. Subaru's main interest in this world so far, aside from learning magic and the sword itself and hoping to have become an awesome swordsman, was magic items. With him and Sylphie having tried their best to make magic items such as the self-tightening screw and others during their childhood. This was a result of that research that he conducted. The only downside is, after he used that attack, his wooden sword fell apart. He hadn't yet been able to find a material that could channel that much magic and also be reusable. Eris would be watching in awe, seeing how awesome the fight between the two was. But Ghislane decided that was the end, saying that he's lost his weapon. Rudeus would try holding his hand up, saying that he's still got plenty of and she'd appear behind him, knocking him out. Subaru would have a black eye and his head would have a bump on it, with Eris saying he totally got wrecked. He'd stand up now, rubbing his head, saying she didn't have to hit him that hard. After sword training, Ghislane would ask him if he'd be willing to teach her magic. She'd ask Subaru what that move he used earlier was, and how if it was magic or some sort of sword skill. Rudeus would smile, saying it's a type of magic he's been working on called enchanting. Rudeus, while not knowing much barrier magic itself, has based this technique off of barriers. From what he learned from Roxy, barrier magic and healing magic are pretty much the extent of the outside of the basic elemental magics. Healing, barriers, and summoning. While it was extremely unrefined, he was essentially creating a barrier to contain his magic using the sword as a sort of catalyst, and by doing this was capable of creating a magic-based weapon that he could use physically. Ghislane would be impressed, never having heard of a magic swordsman, wondering if Paul's son might have more to him than meets the eye. In front of Eris, Ghislane would ask Rudeus if he'd be willing to teach her. This would be exactly what he'd been hoping for, hoping that with his magic he'd be able to entice Ghislane, and thus, Eris would step up saying, "That's not fair. If he's going to be teaching Ghislane, then she wants to learn magic too." Gotcha. Subaru would smirk, saying, fine. Well, for Ghislane, since you'll be willing to teach me the sword, I'd be interested in learning more about the sword god style. I suppose we can trade with that, since I need to be paid for my services. And for Lady Eris, well, Eris would have her hands up saying, that's not fair, you can't just teach Ghislane and not me. Rudeus would smile, saying, alright, well, how about this? If you agree to take your language and writing and math classes with me, I'll also teach you magic. How does that sound? Eris's eyes would light up. Subaru would smirk, saying it worked like a charm. Ghislane would begin training with magic after this alongside Eris, with Eris still now occasionally having bursts of energy, punching Rudeus and running away. She was sticking to her promise. However, as the months were getting closer to her birthday, she was making little to no progress in anything else. Her dance teacher would come up to Rudeus one day, with only a month left before her birthday. Subaru had stumbled upon her crying and running out of the room with her dance instructor, saying, "Screw this, she's not doing it," and running off. She had quickly noticed him before turning, saying, "What is he looking at?" running off into the distance. The dance instructor would come out of the room, sighing, saying, "Rudeus-sensei, I hear that you've been teaching Eris magic and math and writing, and she's been actually attending your lessons. If only I had someone to help me out with my side of things. I don't want Lady Eris to make an embarrassment of herself in front of the court." It was clear what she was asking for. Subaru would make an uncomfortable face, saying that he's not much better at dancing himself, actually, recalling his awkward and horrible cringy moments of middle school. "She'd better not ask me. The only dances I know of are from Fortnite." He'd quickly picture Eris hitting the orange justice in front of the court. "No, I don't think that's exactly what she's looking for." Rudeus would sigh, Subaru saying he'll talk to her and see if she'll agree to come back, with him chasing after Eris, finding her in the stables. She'd be laying on top of a pile of hay. He'd call up to her saying, "Eris, are you there? Your dance instructor's waiting for you to come back." She would completely ignore him, saying she's not going. Rudy would sit down, leaning his head back against the pile of hay, asking why she's so afraid of dancing. "I'm not afraid of dancing. What's the point? It's stupid anyway." Rudeus would speak out loud, with Subaru asking her, doesn't she want to impress her grandfather and all of her family? Wondering if maybe there's some reason why she doesn't want to dance. Who cares about that? After a few moments of silence, Subaru would speak out loud. "I get it. I'm not good at dancing either, to be honest. But I'm not a noble like you are, so it's not like I have a responsibility to learn how. That must suck." This would irritate Eris, with her sliding down the haystack and punching him on the head, saying, "Come on." Huh? Maybe this is how I'll get back at you for making me do all of that writing, and that math too. She'd smirk, grabbing him by the collar and dragging him back to the dance lesson, saying that if she has to learn this stupid stuff, then she's making him pick it up too, with both of them having to learn how to dance now. Eris would actually be ahead of Subaru here. With him not knowing how to dance very well, he'd have to catch up in his own time. Eris would mock him, saying that he's even worse at dancing than she is, and the instructor would now chide Eris, saying that, see, she isn't that bad at all. Subaru would go red in the face, saying, just watch, he's going to become an even better dancer, with the two of them now having a rivalry both in swordsmanship and in dancing. The weeks would pass, with him slowly getting better and even catching up to Eris. The two of them would have been doing a good job. With only a few days left before her actual birthday, the instructor would sigh in relief, saying to Rudeus that it seems Lady Eris might do just fine after all. When the big day finally came, Eris's grandfather would proclaim everyone for silent, introducing Eris, his granddaughter, for her official debut. With that, Saros would clap for his daughter as the official dance would begin, with him proclaiming that anyone who wishes to earn his favor should take his granddaughter's hand. Philip had instructed Subaru not to be involved, saying that they want to keep his presence and identity hidden from the other nobles, particularly the Nodos bloodline of his father. Subaru would watch as multiple young noble men would approach Eris, asking her to dance with them. Just like in the original, Eris would try, but she'd be out of touch with them, their steps misaligned. Subaru would cringe watching as she falls to the floor, with the other noble having been overwhelmed by her speed and them being off pace. Saros would yell out for Eris to get back up, with others now being discouraged and fearful of if they were to mess up and anger Lord Saros. Subaru would gulp and sigh, thinking in his mind, well, I guess this is where it's time for the protagonist to step in. Subaru would step up, offering his hand to Lady Eris, asking her if he may have this dance. While Subaru had been hoping to take advantage of the Boreas library to further research magic items and magical item creation, the last month has been mostly him preoccupied with learning how to dance, so at least it was counting for something. When Eris takes his hand, the two of them would begin dancing. When she'd begin losing her steps, he'd whisper, asking her, Eris, are you nervous? What's wrong? Eris would gulp, saying that grandfather's watching and everyone else. She didn't think it would be this terrifying. Subaru would remember the pressure that he felt. The pressure to be the best. Being the Natsuki son. Having always been number one. And how it felt when he had been pushed out of that light. He'd smile at Eris, saying that nothing's going to be perfect, but they can do this together. He'd tell her to close her eyes and that he'll use a magic spell to make her be able to magically dance better. She'd close her eyes, asking, what? There's a type of magic like that? Subaru would laugh, saying, yep, there sure is. When I say now, I want you to move into the next step, okay? Now. 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 After a few moments, they would have gotten their rhythm back, and the audience would be cheering and clapping as Eris and Rudeus would have completed their dance, with Eris having successfully now started the ball in honor of her birthday. Saros would cheer, now walking up onto the stage and picking up both of the kids, pulling Rudeus and Eris up on his arms, now cheering out loud, saying that was an incredible dance, saying that the future of the Greyrat household is bright. With that, Eris would look over at Rudeus, smiling, with her nightmare having been saved by her friend and teacher. Subaru would smile, laughing, saying that seems it worked out after all, huh? Afterwards, Rudeus would be approached from 3 other noble girls, asking him what his name is and if he was interested in, well, getting to know any of them better. Almost as if on cue, Lord Philip would arrive, telling Rudeus to be careful not to get anyone pregnant, before patting him on the back and walking away. Subaru's brain would proceed to blue screen, as if though on cue, while Rudeus is saying Eris would show up, grabbing him by the collar and saying, yeah, come on, let's go, pulling him out of there. The girls would hold their hand out with Subaru still processing. Of course, Subaru couldn't see it, but Eris would be blushing, saying, there's no need to worry about any of that. After Eris's 10th birthday would end, Philip would then again converse with Rudeus, with Eris now being paraded around by her grandfather. Philip would tell Rudeus that if he wants to become the lead of the Notos household, he'll help stage the coup, saying that he can marry his daughter Eris. Subaru would cough up his drink, now his brain seriously being overwired, as he turns toward Philip saying, "I'm going to assume you must be joking." Worth a shot. This would remind Subaru of when Eris had been trying to get out of her lessons, with Soros having come and talked to him, basically to Rudeus's response and him screaming for her to come down. He'd recall when she pulled her hair up into cattails, or pigtails, acting like a beast person, saying, "Please teach Eris how to use magic and not math." Subaru had cringed, but he also was amazed at her lack of shame. This was another reminder of it. Philip was willing to do anything, but Subaru had his own goal, and he also had no clue on if Philip was joking or not wanting to anger his employer. He'd play it safe. He'd tell Philip that unfortunately there's already a girl he's given his heart to, saying that there's no way he'd ever betray her. He'd use Tyan at the end of Sylphie's name, which at this point is just a key part of Subaru's character, like, come on. But again, Eris's birthday would come to an end. It would be evening, and we'd finally see the scene with Ghislane, Eris, and Rudeus all sitting in Rudeus's room together at the end of the party. With that, Subaru would pull out the wands he had created for Eris and Ghislane, saying that he had successfully graduated them. Within their 2 months, they have both learned how to use Fireball, as well as having done basic math and writing. He'd be proud of them, clapping, saying they've done a good job, even though he'd like Eris to improve on her language a bit more. She'd get irritated at that. With that, we get the same scene with Ghislane offering the story of when she had been a part of the tribe of Beastfolk, as well as giving the ring to Eris, explaining that it's just a superstition, but this ring is supposed to be a talisman to protect you at night from evil wolves. Subaru would ask how she knows it's just a superstition. "Oh, well, I had trouble going to sleep that night, so Paul invited me to go for a swim, and then—" Actually, never mind. I see. The night would end, Ghislane would leave, and Eris had fallen asleep in his bed. Subaru would look, pulling the blanket over her, as he decides to finally open the box he had received from his master, Roxy. You see, after he had begun taking dance lessons and training the two in magic, he had written a letter to his master, explaining that he was serving as a magic tutor now for the young lady of the Boreas household, as well as learning the advanced swordsmanship skills of Ghislane, the Sword King. He'd tell her about his advancement with enchantment magic, the spell he told her he'd been working on for those many years. But he hit a roadblock, so recently he's been researching how to create magic items, as well as some languages, just for fun. He'd asked her if she had any advice on how to learn how to imbue magic into items, specifically in things like equipment. With his description of the self-tightening screws he and Sylphie had developed using wind and earth magic, he asked if she had any advice. Because of this, Roxy would not have written a handwritten book on how to learn the demon language in this timeline, instead sending him a copy of a book from the Royal Library of Sharia. She would copy the book down in both the human tongue and the demon language, the human god and demon god tongues. She comments saying that since Rudeus is such a genius, he might have already figured both of these problems out, knowing how smart he is. But in case she can lend a hand, she hopes this booklet will help him out. P.S. If I ever find this in a bookstore somewhere, I might cry. Rudeus would laugh, saying, "There's no way I'd sell it," deciding that he might want to look into the demon tongue. When Rudeus had been looking into languages, when his magic item research had been coming to a stall, since there just wasn't much research done on it in this world, he had decided to pick up a language from the Witch Continent. As such, he'd been easily picking up languages similar to the human god language, much like the fighting god and the sin god. These two languages being so close to the human god tongue that it was easy for him to pick them up. The demon god tongue, on the other hand, was difficult, and he was having a hard time learning it. But since he had nothing else to do now that the dance and all of his training lessons with them were mostly over, aside from continuing with some math and arithmetic and some magic, he was still learning the sword from Ghislane, of course, as well, but he had a lot of time on his hands, so why not? His room was littered with earth magic he'd used to create new items, with him having created more perfected screws, as well as something he'd been working on in secret. That, of course, being, well, a firearm. He's been working on how to program a one-use firearm, by creating a shaft similar to an actual weapon in real life, and imbuing a stone with the stone cannon spell. Subaru had begun to realize the true potential of silent casting, affecting the unique traits of the spell. With the spoken cast being a default, he had them all memorized perfectly. In silent casts, he noticed that he could alter the feel of the spell while still activating it, such as the size, range, and time it took for the spell to activate. With him being able to enable velocity and differences in physics in spells like Stone Cannon, he was able to create a pre-fired shot, a small revolver that, with proper training, could be used by imbuing just a touch of magic to activate the spell. The problem was, it took him ages to craft a stone bullet spell like this, since essentially the way he was doing it now was by creating a stone bullet at a very small size to fit into the revolver, and then using silent casting, prolonging the activation time as long as possible. Right now, the max he could get it to work was 10 minutes, meaning that if he wanted to load his revolver fully, he'd have to create all of the bullets roughly 10 minutes before in order for them to be usable. At least they'd be instant. But for him it wasn't really worth it, because with silent casting he could instantly cast Stone Cannon at any point he wanted. So this would be good for someone else, but it wasn't really furthering his own goal. And like he told Ghislane a few months ago, he'd been stuck on how to improve his enchantment magic, on how to improve his swordsmanship. Through his training with Ghislane and Eris, he'd already become intermediate in Sword God, now being intermediate in Sword God and Water God style and a beginner in North God. But it was clear that Eris had a talent for it that he didn't, which made him actually feel a bit jealous of her. He'd begin working on transcribing the book from the demon god tongue to the human god tongue, which his master Roxy had provided him so kindly. Because of this little assignment that Roxy had given him, by only copying the book through the demon god tongue and forcing him to transcribe it to human god tongue, he was getting both practice with transcribing the book while also reading in the demon god tongue language, slowly uncovering some of the chapters and secrets of this book Roxy had provided. This book was an old book from the Sharia Magic Royal Library, with it entailing the creation of golems within labyrinths. He was interested for sure, wondering if golems with their autonomous nature and their ability to be controlled remotely from a labyrinth could be applied in some way to his specialty, that is, creating autonomous items or magic items that don't require thoughts or use of mana to implement beyond their basic creation. Of course, Rudeus had only transcribed about a fourth of the book so far, so there was still more to uncover. As more time was passing, one day he'd climb up a tower, hearing provocative moans. He'd find Lord Soros cleaning up after himself, staring out across the horizon. The sky was a hue of orange. Soros would look back to Rudeus, asking what he thinks of it. As Rudeus, Subaru, would look up into the sky, gazing at this dense volume of mana, the prelude to the mana disaster. Rudeus's birthday was fast approaching, with him soon turning 10. He was ecstatic to see Sylphie, his father and mother, and his younger sisters again, and of course Lilia. As the day fast approached, he'd realized that Eris seemed to be keeping him busy, noticing the bustle in the castle was louder than normal. Having realized that today was his birthday, he'd have an idea of what they were planning, but he decided to play dumb for their sake. I wonder what's going on. Maybe I should take a peek. With Rudeus having stayed in with the Boreas family for over a year now, Eris tried her best to preoccupy him from, revealing the secret of their secret party for him. When Eris finally takes him into the Great Hall, he would see Hilda, Philip, Soros, and everyone who had been working at the estate. They'd all wish him a happy birthday. He'd start tearing up with him thanking everyone. He'd look around inquisitively, asking Philip if his family had come. Eris would cough, saying that they'd received a letter that, unfortunately, there's been a lot of monster activity recently, and so the roads were blocked, so his family couldn't make it. Subaru would nod, looking down. I understand. That's disappointing. There'd be an awkward tension in the air as he wipes his tears away, saying he's so happy that everyone here was accepting of him, with Rudeus actually feeling this way. Of course, Subaru would agree that it's been rough, but he's had a good time working here, and he's learned a lot too, enjoying the languages and the books he's read in their library, and the progress, if any, that he's made with his magic item creation ability. He even had made a cool looking statue of Ghislane. although it wasn't his best work. He was still trying to figure out the physics for the tail. When you talked about feeling welcome, Hilda would have rushed forward, embracing Rudeus in her arms, saying that it's okay, you can be our child now. Basically a full 180, just like the original, with us now realizing the real reason Hilda had been so cold to Rudeus, with her sons having been taken by the main Notos branch of the Greyrat family. Hilda would tell Eris that she should basically just marry Rudeus, which would cause everyone again to be shocked and her to be removed from the room. Eris, with that out of the way, would gift Rudeus a staff, saying it's weird that someone so good at magic doesn't have a staff. With that, we would finally reveal the Aqua Hartia for our Saint class water mage, Subaru. He would be in awe, having only thought about how cool swords look. He'd completely forgotten about the Sage class. I look awesome, he'd be thinking. Holding the staff above his head, he'd say, "This is incredible. Thank you." This is when the attendant of the family would begin to explain its materials and how it was crafted, with Subaru seeing the dollar signs rising. He'd quickly try to hand it back, saying that this is way too much. With that, Eris would laugh, and everyone would begin cheerfully celebrating his birthday. Meanwhile, we see Paul and everyone else now out hunting, as monsters have been active more recently. Sylphie would have been staying with them, taking care of Aisha and Norm with Lilia, while Zenith and Paul had been out together, Zenith using her magic and Paul acting as a knight. Some of the other villagers would also be out, with Paul apologizing to Rudy, saying that they would have done everything they could to make it, but I'm sure you'll understand, my son. In the following weeks, Subaru would have decided to take out this new staff for a spin, telling Ghislane and Eris that they're going to head out to the middle of nowhere, where he'll show them his most amazing spell, the spell that earned him the title of a Saint-class water mage. He'd begin casting it, looking up into the air as he begins trying to cast Cumulonimbus. But before he could begin, everything would begin to shake. As a golden light would appear, Ghislane would yell for him to get down. He'd sense it just in time, dropping to the floor as Ghislane's blood-red sword would clash with this masked blonde man, Almanthi of the Bright, the first of the familiars of the legendary hero Perugius, the one who lives in the high-floating castle. Ghislane would state her name, with Almanthi believing that Rudeus was the one causing this mana distortion. Rudeus and Subaru, of course, would have no idea what he's talking about, as Ghislane and Almanthi would be fighting, as the mana distortion would explode. Its light covering everything, Ghislane would be running towards the two, the pillar of light chasing behind her, as Almanthi would disappear back to Chaosbreaker. Eris would be now stock still in fear, as Ghislane would be sucked into the light. Subaru would stand, wrapping himself around Eris in front of her, trying to protect her with his body, as the light would completely cover them. Subaru would close his eyes shut tight. He'd feel a sinking feeling like he'd been sucked into the earth, wondering if this was it, if it was all over, if this was how his second life came to an end. When suddenly he'd open his eyes, it'd be darkness. He'd then feel wind rustling as he's falling. He'd open his eyes more, Eris still curled in a ball, wrapped in his arms, as they're falling from high up. He looked down, seeing flames and some lights, and within the darkness, he'd see a huge stone castle. With the last of his consciousness, he'd hold out his staff, using wind magic to create a barrier with water, catching them in a bubble, as the two would smash into the ground directly outside of the city gates of the royal capital of Lagunica. If you guys want to see a part 4 for What If Subaru was Rudeus Greyrat, make sure to slap all those cool looking buttons down below, harder than Eris was slapping Subaru himself this episode, and we're going to get into some pretty interesting stuff next time. If you guys enjoyed this and want more of this series, make sure to comment down below your thoughts and where you think this story is going from here. I'll catch you guys next time. Ciao.